From Wana Brands, welcome to Enhance Your Life. I'm your host, Jonathan Small, and each week I talk to people from all sorts of professions and backgrounds about how cannabis has enhanced their lives and how this healing plant can enrich your life too. Hey everybody, welcome to the Enhance Your Life podcast. My name is Jonathan Small, and it is great to have you with us today. Today we're going to talk about a topic that I have a lot of interest in. I know a lot of you have interest in, and that is CBD. And specifically, how does CBD help one manage their pain? We read and hear a lot about the wonder compound, CBD, and it can sort of do everything. But what does it really do and how does it work? That's what we're going to dig in today, and we have a perfect expert to do it. Dr. Sara Jane Ward will join us. She is here with us right now. And Sara Jane is an assistant professor in the Department of Pharmacology at the Katz School of Medicine at Temple University. And for many years, she has been digging into the healing properties of cannabis and CBD. And she has received funding for her work from the Department of Defense, the NIH, and others to study the healing properties of CBD. And she's made some real progress. And we're going to talk about that today. Dr. Ward, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It is so nice to be here.
So, quick origin story. Tell me how you got into researching CBD.
So I got my PhD in neuroscience back in 2004, and my PhD work focused on studying substance use disorders. And I'm a behavioral pharmacologist. I do animal work. And so we study the pharmacological effects of different drugs using animal models. And so at that time, I was studying things like cocaine use disorder and opioid use disorder. And interestingly, toward the end of my time in graduate school, there was a new medication that had come on the market in Europe called rimonabant or Acomplia. And this was a pharmaceutical that is targeted to cannabinoid receptors. And the point of this compound, rimonabant, was to block cannabinoid receptors in an attempt to decrease appetite. So the target for this compound was as an anti-obesity agent. The thought being that if cannabis produces the munchies, if we block the cannabis target in the brain, we will reduce appetite. And so those of us substance abuse researchers heard that story and sort of jumped on the bandwagon and thought, oh, well, if cannabis produces euphoria, then perhaps blocking those same receptors will decrease the euphoric effects of drugs. So that's how I fell in love with the cannabinoid receptor system. Before that, cannabinoids and cannabis were totally not on my radar. So that's how I got introduced to cannabis and cannabinoid research. Unfortunately, this compound on the market for obesity eventually got pulled from the European Union due to adverse psychiatric effects. And again, by extension, if cannabis makes you high and happy, perhaps blocking those receptors in the brain can produce some dysphoria and some negative psychiatric effects. So here I was sort of totally on board with cannabinoid research, but I needed a different question and a different way to study it. So I went to a conference and I heard a colleague talk about cannabidiol or CBD, which I had never heard of before. And he's a breast cancer researcher. And he was giving a presentation on mouse models of breast cancer and the protective properties of CBD. I'm not a cancer researcher, but I was aware of pain associated with cancer, as well as pain associated with cancer chemotherapy. So I became very intrigued by CBD and went back home to my laboratory at Temple and did some investigations. What is CBD and might it be useful as a treatment for pain? And then just one last quick piece. One of the reasons why I was so interested in CBD is because as a substance use researcher, I have not been as interested in the therapeutic application of THC or of whole cannabis, which has associated with it causing a high euphoria and the potential for cannabis use disorder. So the notion that there were chemicals in the plant that might be devoid of these so-called psychoactive effects, but they themselves may have some sort of therapeutic properties was really exciting to me.
So you are not studying you're studying CBD without any THC. You're studying the isolate CBD, or are you studying both?
So we do study both. We study more than just CBD. Actually, one of the most exciting studies I think that we've done in the laboratory was looking at combinations of CBD and THC. So I sort of, I'm interested in understanding the pharmacological effects of isolate, distinct chemical constituents of the plant alone, as well as what are the effects of these constituents when they're given together. One thing I learned early on going to cannabinoid conferences was this concept of the entourage effect. And as a scientist who wants to see data to improve these kinds of things, again, I went back to the laboratory, I did some computer searches and found that no one had really quantified the interactive effects of things like THC and CBD. So many people talk about the fact that CBD may enhance THC's effects or CBD may decrease some of the adverse effects of THC. But it really hadn't been investigated in a scientific manner. So that's another part of the kind of research that we do in the laboratory.
So interesting what you're doing, and so needed because of the sort of status of cannabis in this country and its legality federally. I know that it's hard to get the funding and the government support. How are you able to do it? How are you able to work around those restrictions?
Yeah, so the atmosphere has definitely changed in the past. So I've now been doing cannabinoid research for 17 years, and the funding landscape has changed pretty dramatically. I will say that, even at the time that I began doing cannabinoid research, the compounds were available and are available to me as an animal researcher. So I have fewer hurdles from that, standpoint to test cannabinoids in the laboratory. And from a funding standpoint, there was a little bit out there, especially to study adverse effects of cannabinoids. But it was at the time that I started much more challenging to acquire funding to look at potential therapeutic effects. As you mentioned in the introduction, interestingly, my first source of major funding to do my work was from the Department of Defense. They were very interested in understanding the therapeutic potential of cannabinoids. That project was focused on spinal cord injury and pain and other debilitating effects associated with spinal cord injury. So they were very open to understanding what what the
encouraging and really interesting, because it's certainly not it's pretty much frowned upon, I know, in terms of having people use it who are at active duty. But as far as injured, so what did you find out? Tell me about that Department of Defense study.
Yeah, so we did get some positive results with CBD in that model. And what we really found was that the percentage of animals that went on to develop chronic pain following spinal cord injury was significantly reduced if they were administered CBD after their spinal cord injury. We did not see improvement on some other interesting endpoints. We also look at more like functional recovery of locomotion and things like that, as well as recovery of bladder function, which is really one of the most debilitating side effects or consequences of spinal cord injury. So, as you mentioned, a lot of people will say, CBD can do everything. It didn't fix everything, but we did get some promising effects from those studies.
So I guess I'll ask the question. I know it's a simple question with a complicated answer, but, does CBD help with pain? Because you hear, just anecdotally, I hear a lot of people ask me this question because of what I do for a living. And it seems personal to me. Like, it seems to work for some people. It doesn't seem to work well for other people. But of course, we don't know what kind of CBD they are. Are they using snake oil, or are they using like real pure CBD? We don't know how they're using it, as tinctures, as topicals, et cetera. So I know it's a complicated answer, but in general, is there potential for CBD to help with pain management?
Yeah, so I would say in my world of animal research, from my laboratory and from many others across the globe, we find some very positive results with CBD in various models of pain. So, on a very basic level, we definitely see differences in the types of pain that can be successfully treated with CBD. And we see things like it's very important the dose that's used, the dosing strategy that's used. So you can imagine, as you've alluded to, that when you take rigorous experimental control that goes on in these laboratories and project that to people out in the world buying various products from various sources, using it in various ways, and people may have very complex different types of pain, I'm not surprised that some people say, yes, I took CBD and it's really improved my pain status, where other people are taking it and not finding that. I'll give you an example from the laboratory. So the animal model of pain that we studied most rigorously in my laboratory is the chemotherapy-induced neuropathic pain that I mentioned. So we take rodents, we administer chemotherapeutic agents, and those rodents go on to develop touch sensitivity in their paws, just like some people who undergo cancer chemotherapy treatment get touch and temperature sensitivity in their hands and feet, which can be very debilitating. So when we studied this in the laboratory, our first breakthrough finding was that if we treat the mice prophylactically with CBD before they are exposed to chemotherapy, that is extraordinarily effective. So we can prevent those animals from developing chemotherapy-induced neuropathic pain if we have the CBD on board ahead of time. If we give the chemotherapeutic agent first and the animals go on to develop neuropathic pain, we don't have as much success. We don't see as robust results in being able to reverse that in the animals if we give them CBD.
So it works more as a preventative, right, than if you're actually feeling acute pain and you use it to manage that pain.
Right, yeah. And so another way to think about that is making a comparison between CBD and something like an opioid. So we're all very familiar with the fact that opioid analgesics are very powerful analgesics, right? So we can, use them for operative situations, intense acute pain. Like you mentioned, I have a broken bone or, some dental procedure done. They are really good at blocking acute pain. They're not as good at treating neuropathic pain. The cannabinoids, on the flip side, from what our research and others shows, is that they are not what you want to reach for to prevent very severe acute pain, and seem to be more effective for modulating neuropathic pain. So that could be, one reason why some people report having beneficial effects of CBD and others don't. We also see in these experiments that the amount of CBD that we give the animals is very important. And we also see this with THC. And this is something that has been seen even in the small amount of human clinical data that we have for cannabinoids, is that less can be more, and that very low doses of CBD or THC may be effective, and that it's possible that they will lose their effectiveness if higher doses are taken. So again, going back to not knowing what kind of product someone is using, how much they are using, there is also a potential for sort of overshooting a potentially therapeutic dose. And we do observe that in our animal studies as well. So those are sort of 2 or 3 reasons why I'm not surprised that we can find very positive, exciting results in very specific animal models. And then when you go out into the world and you ask 20 people who have tried CBD, you're going to get a mixed bag of
different
results.
answers. Well, let's talk about, because I know you've studied CBD and how it works with THC. So one thing I hear a lot, and often from cancer survivors and people who are managing the pain that comes with having cancer, is that, they were on opioids. You hear this story a lot. I was on opioids. I hated it, was addicted. And then I, gave my mother, or I tried a THC product, and that was like a game changer. And I don't know, again, if they're talking about a CBD to THC product. I'm not always, I'm just talking here anecdotally, but does THC being in the mix change it somewhat? Does that add the pain relief?
Yeah. So what we've seen and I'll go back to the chemotherapy-induced neuropathic pain model, because that's where we did the most extensive research on that particular question. So THC in animal models produces very positive effects in certain pain models. Again, not very strong effects on acute pain, similar to like how we were talking with CBD. But with other types of chronic pain models, THC works very well. And the main reason why folks like myself look toward other compounds like CBD is not necessarily because we doubt that THC will be effective, but are concerned over the potential adverse effects. So going back to the mouse model of chemotherapy-induced pain, THC works really well in that model. CBD works really well in that model. So it's difficult to say, do they work better? Because in that controlled environment, they both already work really well. But what I can say is that when we give them in combination, we can use drastically lower doses of each component to achieve the same therapeutic effect. So each drug becomes more potent, which, again, if you're thinking about THC and potential adverse effects, if you can give a 10-fold lower dose or lower concentration, that should reduce the presence of adverse effects. So from what we've seen in the laboratory, it's not necessarily that they are more effective when given together, but you can give less of each drug to achieve the same effect as you can with a higher dose of one component. And again, that's not to say that they also may not be able to produce stronger effects in a different pain model or in a much more complex system, like a person experiencing more complicated neuropathic pain. But those have been our observations.
When we say low dose, how do we explain that to people who might be listening to this saying, well, what does a low dose mean? Because I think one of the most complicated things about CBD and really cannabis in general is nobody really ever knows exactly what dose to take. It's not like, you pick up an Advil and you're like, okay, 2 pills. It's like, what's the right amount? I mean, everybody kind of knows, Advil, I need to take 1 or 2 or 3. People just kind of know. But with CBD, it's a little more complicated, obviously different for different people. But when you say a low dose, what specifically do you mean?
Yeah, so that's the question that I most wish I could answer for people. Of course, I shouldn't really be answering that question for people because I'm not a doctor. I have a PhD. Maybe I could give you advice on your pet rat at home, but I'm not a clinician. But
Frisky, my rat, needs some advice on this. But anyway, go on.
Right, exactly. Because animal research has been able to progress over the last several decades by doing all of these rigorous dosing studies, we have an extraordinarily good handle on the dosing requirements in these various animal models for pain as an endpoint and for other indications as an endpoint as well. Without clinical trials, and currently there are no completed clinical trials for CBD alone for pain, we are in the dark outside of relying on people's anecdotal stories or physicians who were, I do know that there are many physicians who work with patients who get medical cannabis cards and advise them when they go to a dispensary, but that's still not been something that's been figured out. There are a few very small clinical studies with CBD for other endpoints that may give us some ideas of the dosing range. There have been a few studies for anxiety disorder in humans. It was a public speaking experiment that was conducted.
I've written about that.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, and it helped.
Yes.
Yep.
And there have been some small trials looking at schizophrenia. And then, of course, the massive clinical trials with Epidiolex for the treatment of childhood seizure disorders. From those three studies, or those three endpoints, three very different dose ranges were found to be effective, with the Epidiolex studies really requiring very high doses of CBD. And again, just quickly touching back to what you were saying about THC, that is an area where there is a lot of conversation around the impact that a little bit of THC might have on CBD's anti-seizure effects. Not my area of expertise, but that is one of those areas where people are very interested in how those combinations may work and may change effectiveness. That is unfortunately going to remain an unanswered question. Again, outside of, I know you can talk to medical professionals who work with patients and probably feel very confident that they have some idea about effective doses. But for someone like myself, I want to read the clinical trial and I want to see what were the doses that were tried and what was effective. There are currently 2 clinical trials ongoing based on the work we've done with the chemotherapy-induced neuropathic pain. One is taking place at Columbia University in New York City, and the other is taking place at Lankenau Hospital, which is just outside of Philadelphia, up the road from me. And they are studying patients with diagnosed chemotherapy-induced neuropathic pain. The Columbia study is testing CBD-THC combinations, and the Lankenau study is testing just CBD. So hopefully in a year or two, when they get through all of their enrollments and get enough patients through the experiment, we can have some clinical data to whether those cannabinoid-based treatments worked and at what doses. But yeah, that is, I think, the biggest problem plaguing the field for people who are looking for guidance for CBD.
Why are you only able to work with animals at this point? Is that just because of what the law requires?
That's just based on my training.
That's your training.
Yeah, that's where my expertise is. But I do have colleagues all across the country and actually across the world who do study these same things in humans. So, I'm a behavioral pharmacologist who studies animals. There are other trained behavioral pharmacologists who do the same kinds of laboratory-based studies, including pain studies, and administer things like THC, CBD under controlled experimental settings. Those won't be like large-scale clinical trials. They are more like a small study to see whether CBD produces a particular adverse effect, a subjective effect. Does THC and CBD in combination make a person feel subjectively more or less high than either drug alone? So, more basic science type questions. But those experiments are going on, and those are very expensive. And so I think the people who have them have most benefited from an increase in funding on cannabinoid research have been the clinical researchers, because finally the National Institutes of Health are giving out more grants for that type of human research on cannabinoid effects.
You mentioned, I think at the top of the interview, about the effect, or I wonder if you looked into the effect of CBD minimizing the psychotropic effects of THC, or just basically, I guess in layman's terms, if you get really high, does it help to take CBD, pure CBD, to kind of bring you down a bit? I've wondered that.
Yeah, we have found no in our animal models. We haven't asked that specific question. I've looked at things like learning and memory deficits, withdrawal effects. So we haven't specifically asked the animals, do you feel less high? You actually can ask
Oh, you
animals.
can? How do you
Yeah,
ask them?
yeah.
How
So
does it work?
there's a experiment called drug discrimination, which is one of my favorites as an animal behavioral pharmacologist. You train animals to basically report to you what their feeling is based on what drug you've given them. So you could train an animal up to press a certain lever in their cage every time you give them an injection of saline.
Mm-hmm.
And they get a food reward. On other days, you can give them an injection of THC, for an example, and train them that when you feel like that, you now will get food reward if you press this other lever in your cage. And so
Do they want
basically,
more food when they're high? They get the munchies?
no, they want food because
Yeah.
they're rats and they're
Yeah.
they're treats. We give them like banana flavored pellets.
Right.
And so, on a saline day, they go right over and they press that lever saying, yep, this is a saline day, and they get rewarded. If they press the wrong lever, they don't get rewarded. So we can ask them, how,
Yeah.
what does this feel like? So you could treat those animals on a test day. You could give them THC and CBD in combination and see whether they now feel the same way or do they feel differently. So there are experiments like that. There's some indication in the literature, in very few studies, that CBD may impact a wide range of effects of THC, but for the most part, we haven't seen that as much in our animal studies as people report that.
I'm thinking, do you sort of see CBD as maybe more effective I know you're not a medical doctor, but just based on your research, as a vitamin? Like when you say it's a preventative, I almost wonder, like, is it something that should we be taking a little CBD every morning, with our coffee, like to help, what's your take on that?
So my gut reaction is no, only because I feel pretty strongly at this point that I would like to see CBD more thought of as a prescription. It can cause some potential adverse effects, and I think we are at our infancy of studying those. So I had mixed feelings when I walked into the grocery store and saw that I can buy CBD off the shelf instead of ordering it from a vendor with my drug license.
Mm-hmm.
I had a lot of mixed feelings on that. One of the things that the Epidiolex clinical trials brought to light is there is a potential for CBD to have very significant drug-drug interactions. So CBD is metabolized by the liver by some of the same enzymes that metabolize other drugs that people may be commonly using, either by prescription or over the counter. And it was also shown in that study, and now others in follow-up, that if somebody has decreased liver function, that there can be added hepatotoxic effects by using CBD. So things like that make me concerned when thinking about something that wouldn't be regulated or that people
Right.
wouldn't be advised, what other medications are you taking? Do you have any other lifestyle effects like being a high alcohol drinker that may be associated with decreased liver impairment that may make it not a great idea for you to be popping a couple CBD in the morning? So I feel like we need much more information about
Yeah.
how safe and effective CBD is before thinking of it that way. So I would like to see a lot more rigorous research and investigation on the human level first to demonstrate that it is effective for something and that it is safe enough to be treated like something that you would purchase over the counter.
How about you? Do you use CBD personally?
I don't. I have tried it before. I've not experienced any particular responses to it. And, I'm a little bit of a chronic pain sufferer with my neck. I suffer some neck and sort of upper shoulder pain. And so I did try CBD and I got zero relief from it. And so again, things like if it is a pain that comes from a source that is bone related or joint related, like osteoarthritis versus rheumatoid arthritis, I think the source of the pain will be very important in determining whether or not something like CBD would be effective for it. I can tell you that my dad suffers from arthritis in his hands and doesn't want to, he's a, I'm not going to take any medicine kind of guy. But he loves his daughter. He's very impressed with me. So I went home one day and said, here's a tub of CBD cream. Try it out. And he swears by it. And he says,
some people it really helps.
Yeah. So, and I've talked to people on both sides of the spectrum. Again, going back to what I said about CBD not working in our animal model to treat someone who already has chemotherapy-induced neuropathic pain. Now, I say that those are the observations we made in our animal model. I have talked to many people who have come up to me and said, oh my goodness, I've had this chemotherapy-induced neuropathic pain, and once I started using CBD for it, it has changed my life. So I don't want to sound dismissive of people's experiences. It's just when I go out into the world and speak as a scientist, I want to be able to speak based on what the scientific evidence is. But, I've met those people.
Yeah, we all have. I think the jury's still out. And again, I'm so happy that you're doing the research you're doing. And I'm happy to hear there's more research coming down the pike. And hopefully we'll get to and hopefully the CBD will also be more regulated, because I agree that, anybody could say something is CBD and throw it at a water or whatever. And, who knows what you're
Yeah, I think one of the most
imbibing.
recent studies that had come out over the past couple of years was something like a sampling of various CBD products found that 75% of them contained more or less CBD than was reported.
Right.
So,
That's what happens.
It's a tough,
in an unregulated.
Yeah, it's a tough area. So, that's why the presumption is that obtaining these products from a medical cannabis dispensary, again, depending on what the regulations are like in folks' individual states, that there may be a little bit more faith that those products are regulated and have in them what they say they have.
What they say to do. Well, Dr. Ward, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. This has been fascinating. So have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thank you. It was my pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Enhance Your Life is brought to you by Wana, the #1 infused product in North America. Wana's entire process is designed to deliver the same great experience time after time. They have spent years fine-tuning their recipes so that their products are delicious, consistent, and potent. For more information, head on over to wanabrands.com. That's Wana, W-A-N-A, brands.com.